Hi, and welcome to this follow-up to the IEG's Introduction to 18 U.S.C. 209 and 5 CFR 2635-503. In this video, we'll go over a hypothetical scenario to see how 209 and 503 operate in practice. I'm Morse Barron, an assistant counsel in OGE's Ethics Law and Policy branch. Let's get started. Next slide, please. This is our hypothetical. I'll read it. An individual is entering government service, and her current employer has a policy of paying out severance payments to departing employees based on a formula that factors in the years the employee spent with the company and the compensation of the employee's final year with the company. The company will pay severance to any employee who goes to work for the federal government. The employee is going to work for the Department of Defense, and the approximate value of the payment is $60,000. The current employer knows that the individual intends to work for the executive branch, but does not know in which department or agency. Finally, the individual's current employer is a DoD contractor. Next slide, please. Before we analyze the scenario we just read, I want to remind you that 209 is an intent-driven crime. Intent is the only thing that distinguishes an innocent payment for services provided in one's private capacity and having nothing to do with government work from a payment for one's government services. You must make a determination of whether you think there is a real potential for a 209 violation based on the totality of the circumstances. However, you are not determining whether you think 209 will be violated, but only whether there is a real possibility. And if there is, as a provider of perspective and prudent guidance, you must direct the employee to reject the payment. Now, let's refresh ourselves on the elements for 209. Next slide, please. As we keep in mind the hypothetical we read, the question we need to answer is, if the severance payment was to be paid out in installments during the individual's government service, should you advise the employee that he or she may accept the installment payment, and why? So with this, let's look at the elements for a 209 violation. First, we just stated that the payments would be received during government service. So that means we have an officer or employee of the executive branch. Second, this government employee will receive something of value, specifically approximately $60,000. Next, in number 4 on the slide, the cash will come from a source other than the United States, since we know it's coming from the former employer. We now have 3 of the 4 elements met, but when we look at the last element, number 3 on the slide, is this severance payment, in fact, compensation for services as an employee of the United States? To figure this out, let's look to some of the factors discussed in OGE Informal Advisory Opinion 02X4, which you may want to have available as we go through the factors. And it's still OGE's most comprehensive guidance on 209. So let's get going. All right, in this instance, it is not the expressed intent of the payer to compensate for government service. Rather, the company is paying based on a formula of past service to the company and final year of service. Next, what about the ability to influence? Well, the employee would potentially be in a position to influence the government on behalf of the payer, but we would need more facts here. The company does not know the employee would be in the position because the company does not know that the employee is going to the Department of Defense. Let's look at another factor. Is there a substantial relationship between DoD and the former employer? The answer is yes, since the current employer is a DoD contractor. And the next factor, is the payment being given to the employee because of his or her official government position? At least not solely because of the official position, since the payment is given because of their service to the company and a decision to go into the federal government. Let's take a look at another factor. which is whether the payor is a government employee, which can sometimes point to it being a gift. However, here, the payer is a former employer, not a federal employee. Next, the circumstances do indicate that the payment is motivated, at least partially, by a desire other than to compensate the employee for government service. The payment here is provided to compensate the employee for past service to the company, but it only compensates individuals who go into a federal government position. Let's look at the next factor. Similar payments are not made to non-federal employees. As we just mentioned, the company's policy only compensates individuals who go into a federal government position. And the last factor we'll look at is we'll consider another factor we'll look at states that an intent to compensate for government services cannot be inferred from a bona fide award for public service. However, severance payment here is not a bona fide public service award. So, what do we take from this information? Some of the factors do point to the payment potentially being for government service. However, the company is saying that it is paying the leaving employee for past service. But the former employee will only do this when the leaving employee goes into the federal government. So, there are indications that the severance payment is for past service to the company, but it is also true that the payment would not be provided but for the employee's decision to go into federal service specifically. Under these circumstances, OGE and OLC have stated that the individual may not accept the payment. It is just not possible to ensure that the true nature of the payment is to compensate the individual for past service to the company and not future government service. The 209 analysis here is largely dictated by the fact that similar payments are not made to non-federal employees. Again, you can find these factors discussed in OGE Informal Advisory Opinion 02X4. Next slide, please. Now, let's look at 503. As you can see on the slide, in this instance, the severance is paid out before the individual starts government service, which puts us in 503 territory. Next slide. As we look at the hypothetical again, our question here is, if the approximately $60,000 severance payment was to be paid out before the individual starts government service, would the payment qualify as an extraordinary payment under 2635-503? Why or why not? Next slide, please. Here we have the elements for who is covered by 2635-503. Number one, an individual who is receiving an item with a value greater than $10,000. In this instance, we have an approximately $60,000 severance payment. Number two, in our hypothetical, the company knows that the individual is going to work for the executive branch. And note that for this element, it is not necessary that the company know which agency. So this element is satisfied as well. What about the third element? Is the company's severance program established? Next slide, please. As you may remember, established means the program is in writing or there is a history of similar payments made to others not entering government. Let's look at number two first. The company policy does not have a history of similar payments made to others not entering the government. We know this because the company's policy only compensates individuals who go into a federal government position. But let's now look at number one. It's possible that the severance policy may be in writing. We just don't know because there's not enough facts provided in the hypo. So In this situation, you will need to go gather more facts on this point in order to determine whether the policy is in writing. If it is in writing, the policy would be considered established and the employee would have no 503 restriction. Next slide, please. We have reached the end, and I want to thank you for watching. I hope this has been helpful and that you feel better prepared to analyze the next 209 or 503 issue you come across. If you have questions when you are addressing a 209 or 503 situation, please feel free to contact your desk officer who will be happy to help you. Again, thank you.